Welcome to 5 Questions with Dr. Janay Nugent. I'm Dr. Christine Alexander. I work at the University of Lethbridge, where I'm a Canada Research Chair, Associate Professor of History, and I also co-direct the Institute for Child and Youth Studies. My colleague, Dr. Janay Nugent, is also an Associate Professor in the History Department at the U of L. And starting next month, I'm happy to say that she will also be Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts and Science. She has had an impressive research career as well, and she is co-editor of 2 books with Dr. Elizabeth Ewan from the University of Guelph. And these are Finding the Family in Medieval and Early Modern Scotland, which was first published in 2008 and was reprinted, this doesn't happen to every history book, in 2016. And the other volume that she edited with Dr. Ewan is called Children and Youth in Pre-Modern Scotland, which came out in 2015. Janay is co-author as well with Laura Stewart, a historian from the University of York in England, of Union and Revolution, Scotland and Beyond, 1625 to 1745, which is forthcoming this December with Edinburgh University Press. So that's a lot of books, but she's still working on another one. This is a monograph that is tentatively titled Through the Eyes of a Child, Early Modern Scotland. And this book project uses the child-centered perspective of child and youth studies to offer a fresh interpretation of the history of Scotland between the years 1560 and 1700. It includes chapters on religion, urban life, family life, health and wellness, and youth culture. And together, all of these parts will ultimately enhance, enrich, and change our understanding of larger historical processes, including religious reformation and witch hunts. Janay is a founding member of the University of Lethbridge's Institute for Child and Youth Studies. She is a past Board of Governors teaching chair, and I also need to mention that she has earned 2 really significant teaching awards, the U of L Students' Union Teaching Excellence Award and the ULEF Distinguished Teaching Award. Welcome, Janay. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's a pleasure. So, yeah, COVID-19 has changed the way that we live and work, and many of us, professors included, are stuck at home, and members of the public are stuck at home too. And so one of the purposes of this, what we're calling the COVID-19 rebooted version of the Public Professor Series hosted by the U of L, is meant to bring professors' research to a wide audience, but also to provide an opportunity for people who might have been to hear past talks in person to get a sense of what the latest, most up-to-date research our U of L professors are working on right now. So that's the first of my 5 questions for you. What are you working on these days?
I've got a few projects on the go. One that I've just finished, which I'm really excited about that you mentioned, was the University of Edinburgh Press, Union and Revolution, Scotland and Beyond, 1625 to 1745. I always have to think about those dates. That project was particularly exciting for me because it was meant to be both a textbook and a book that was for the general public. It's University of Edinburgh Press's flagship series on Scottish history. And so it's meant to really connect with a wider audience. And I was really excited to be able to add to that volume a chapter on community, family, gender, and youth. And that was pretty exciting because so often we think about history as being from the top down. We think about large historical processes and wars and kings and military leaders and that sort of a thing. But for me, history is much more interesting about the people who lived that time period and shaped that time period beyond those who were in the greatest period positions of wealth and power. So that was an exciting project to be involved in, and that's coming out shortly. So that will be nice to see out in print. I'm also just finished co-editing a chapter with former master student Ray Stauffer on children and wives of ministers in the Scottish Reformation, looking at how they were central to the entire reforming process, which was basically In 1560, the Scottish Parliament said, we are now going to become a Calvinist nation. Too bad that you were all Roman Catholic up until this point for centuries and centuries and centuries. But now everybody has to convert because that's the law. And so my question is always, how does that happen? And so so it was fun to kind of look at that process beyond just the really famous ministers like John Knox, who railed fire and brimstone from the pulpits, but to look beyond that to their children and to their wives and the roles that they played in bringing Reformation to communities and really helping to change the religious cultures. So that was a fun chapter to be involved in. I'm also working right now on writing a chapter for Paragon Journal, which is a journal out of Australia. And it is on youth in revolution in Scotland in the 17th century. The special edition is on children in warfare. So that'll be a fun chapter to be writing. And then the other one that I'm just about in the final stages of passing over is a chapter on concepts of youth for the Bloomsbury series on youth. And I know you're involved in that and you know actually quite a lot more about that series than I do. I'm just a one chapter editor, but you are a editor for an entire volume. So
yeah, that's right, Janay. I am indeed. So, and I also love that we are both, we're not a big history department at the University of Lethbridge, but the fact that we are scholars who study two different eras, who are both involved in this global project with experts from around the world, I think it's really exciting. So I'm looking forward to reading your chapter on the early modern period. Not least because I, as you mentioned, with one of my British colleagues, am editing the last volume in the series. It's a series of 6 books, so it's an enormous undertaking that Bloomsbury, an academic publishing house, has decided to put together. And the volume that my colleague and I are editing is the most recent one, and our purview is covering youth cultures around the whole world over the past 100 years. So between 1920, so if you think of, the introduction of the First World War has just ended, it's a time of jazz music and flappers, and then the intervening 100 years ending with really today, youth activism, youth cultures in the 21st century.
Yeah, it is a really exciting undertaking, this series. What do you think some of the most interesting pieces are that have come out of your volume?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would say there were so many, and I would say that one of them is that you can see some continuities across time. So I also have written a chapter for the 19th century volume, and one of the things that we can see, I would say, and I am curious to hear if this is the case in the early modern period as well, but the chapter I wrote for the 19th century volume, it ends up being about kind of the birth of expertise and how adults, because they're worried about the future of their society, of nation states, of imperial regimes. They think that young people need to understand them. So young people, it turns out, have been at the heart, as you say, of war, revolution, these big questions, but they've also been at the heart of development of what we think of as modern academic disciplines. So some of the earliest texts that I looked at from the late 19th and into the early 20th century were these foundational studies by anthropologists, Margaret Mead, hanging out with and studying girls in Samoa. And she writes this best-selling book that changes a whole field. So I would say that's one of the most interesting things that I found. And I think it was especially for me working on this volume, historians were used to talking about the past, but part of our purview with this volume was to bring it right up to the present day. And so that has been challenging, but also I would say really rewarding, not least because it has allowed us to talk about things like things that you have talked about as well, as unemployment, young people having expectations about what their adult lives might look like. But because of bigger things that are going on in the world, and I would add COVID-19 to this longer list now, it means that they're not able to achieve adulthood, independence in the way that they thought they would probably be going to. And there's a scholar, I think an anthropologist, who has created a new word basically to describe this, and she calls it waithood. So they're waiting, a state of waiting, and they haven't achieved adulthood yet. They don't know when this state of waithood is going to end. And it can be a time of, a productive time, but also a time of real social tension.
Yeah, high anxiety for the individuals involved as well. Hey, oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't heard of waithood yet. So, yeah, well, I need to add that to my repertoire for sure, because the early modern period is certainly that. The end of youth in the early modern period is getting married, and that's mid-20s for women, late 20s for men, and so they spend a long time as being youth and not being considered as adults in that community. So it is very, very relevant and applicable, as you said, across the centuries. So that's super interesting.
Yeah, we could talk about this all day, I think. So, but mindful of time, I'm going to move on to my second question for you, which is something that you and I have talked about extensively. It's something that as historians who study young people, I certainly get asked a lot, which is, why are you doing this work? Young people, why do you study kids? Surely there's something a little more important, something weightier that you should be devoting your time to better understanding. And so I have an answer for that question, and I know you do too. So I would love to hear what you have to say when people ask you this.
I do get asked that quite often, especially as a historian. Everybody assumes, as I've already said, that history is about the powerful, about the names that have survived to us. But to me, history is about the people who have lived and shaped those worlds. And I think that for my time period, this is very much a time period where there is what demographers would refer to as a youth bulge, meaning that the largest demographic group are those who have not yet achieved adulthood. And so if we're going to look at the early modern period, which is a period roughly 1500 to 1800, it is characterized politically by the centralization of states. It's characterized economically by the creation of a global economic system, largely built on the slave trade. It is a period characterized religiously as the splintering of Christianity. Up until in the medieval period, most of Europe was Roman Catholic. In the early modern period, the Reformation, religious Reformation happens. You end up with numerous Christian denominations. This is also a time period of high economic inflation, instability, underemployment. It's also a period of disease and warfare. There's many civil wars being fought, often in the name of religion. There's also wars between countries, often in the name of religion, but also because as states were centralizing and borders were firming up, they're expanding their territory. It's a period of great instability. And so for me, if we're going to, people often say, well, it's about the generals and the kings and the queens and all that sort of thing. But I think it's actually more about the young people. And if you spend the time to look at the young people that are involved in all of these processes, you realize that even in the early modern period, those who were in positions of power were most concerned about the young people. They offered a threat, but also they offered stability at the same time. So if you could really educate and shape the young people, you could shape them in the image into a society that you want to have happen. But young people have their own minds and they have their own investments in the future. And so they're very much on the front lines of these civil wars. They're on the front lines of the exploration into different parts of the globe and Europe's interests and conquests in the rest of the globe. They're everywhere in all of these different things. Religious reformation as well. They're often at the very forefront of religious reform. And so I think that to not really understand the young people and how they shaped those futures and what those futures meant for them, that we're really missing out and not really understanding those larger historical processes.
Thank you. Unsurprisingly, I agree completely with everything you just said. Yeah, and I think I would just add that, as you say, the stakes, if you look more closely at what are really, really interesting, it turns out, historical sources and stories, it turns out that the stakes are actually really high for societies, nations, empires, religions, when it comes to dealing with young people. So thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to my third question now, which is a slightly broader one, and it gives us an opportunity to talk a little more about the work, all kinds of exciting work that is happening at the University of Lethbridge. So over the past 10 years, I would say the U of L has really transformed itself into a center, a leader, nationally and internationally in the interdisciplinary field of child and youth studies. And that's one of the things that I really love about working there. And I'm hoping that you will be able to tell us a little bit more about how this particular aspect of the U of L has shaped your work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been absolutely key and central to the development of my own scholarship. So the University of Lethbridge, one of the founding principles is liberal education. And by liberal education, it is not at all political in the word liberal. It's meant in terms of the freeing of the mind, I think, is kind of how it's translated. And so by that, what we are meaning is that it's very much about an interdisciplinary approach where you look at complex problems from a variety of disciplinary perspectives. And so you make those connections and you think critically across disciplinary perspectives. And the entire building of University Hall, the iconic Arthur Erickson structure, was built so that faculty members would walk down these long hallways and have to pass their colleagues in all different disciplines and have conversations. And the history department used to be up in Turcotte Hall, and we were in the basement, and we were sort of isolated in the basement by ourselves. And that was great. It was wonderful. It was a great community. But in 2009, we were moved down to University of Hall, and that actually was the beginning of my child and youth studies journey. I'd been studying, this question of how does a nation convert an entire population's religion. And I'd been coming across over and over and over again this emphasis on young people, this fear of young people as well, those who didn't conform. What were we going to do with them? And, putting in place all these structures to try to get them under control. And so that was really interesting. But as I was in University Hall and started talking to a lot of colleagues, Jan Newberry in anthropology, Heidi MacDonald, who was already in history, we talked about some of this. There's Louise Barrett in psychology, Sergio Pellis in neuroscience, Elizabeth Galloway in English, and Amy von Hiking in the Faculty of Education. And so that was kind of the beginning crew who started talking about, well, this is really interesting because, neuroscientists, psychologists, historians, English scholars, we are all asking similar questions, but we come at it from such a different perspective. And when you start to look at how others are asking those questions, it starts to advance the way that a historian thinks. And it's very much interdisciplinary. And so we got really excited. We'd play a game, which I know when you came in as a chair of Canada Research Chair in Child and Youth Studies, and it was one of your interview questions, right? It was, let's play our game, which is let's talk about risk and resilience. How would you look at that question? And so we would bring these questions and issues and themes that were part of our research, and we would find this out. And we ended up creating a couple of conferences. And we competed for a chair of a Canada Research Chair in Child and Youth Studies, and we got you, which was fantastic. The first and I believe the only humanities chair on campus, which is super important as well. And so this has very much shaped and pushed forward my own research and really forced me into the child-centered perspective, which is at the core of the approach of child and youth studies. And so these are, the University of Lethbridge has been really central for that. And I think that's why we've become such a real piece of strength and an area of strength. But I know many of us in that first generation have handed off the mantle to the second generation of child and youth studies scholars, and you are really setting the world on fire with really innovative workshops, graduate mentorship and training, that sort of thing. Do you want to talk a little bit about it? Because you know more about it than I do, obviously.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Well, I would say that so there's a new crop, I would say, of faculty members who have joined the Directorate of the Institute for Child and Youth Studies from every faculty in the university. And I think that that's also really worth pointing out. So arts and science, education, I don't think we have one from management. Yet, fine arts and health science. So as you say, it's basically bringing a question or a problem or an issue, right? Which includes young people, something that, as we have heard, have vexed and perplexed adults for centuries. And so it's really, I think, as you say, been a fruitful pursuit to have these big conversations. And we don't always agree also. Across different disciplines. So one of the things that I'm supposed to do as a Canada Research Chair is basically help to create a culture of research training at the University of Lethbridge. And so the Institute for Child and Youth Studies has really been central to my efforts along those lines. And it's been great to work with such an amazing group of colleagues. And so one of the things that I have found especially rewarding is working with students, with undergraduate students and graduate students. And we also recently had a postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Erin Spring, who was the first postdoc in the humanities at the University of Lethbridge, who has now got a great job at the Workland School of Education at the University of Calgary. So working with these different levels of students, with faculty members, and together with community organizations. So organizations like Obacasan Early Intervention Society, the Galt Museum, Boys and Girls Club of Lethbridge, and most recently for me also the Lethbridge Public Interest Research Group, or also known as LPIRG. So this has really helped, I think, to connect the research that our students are doing and that faculty are doing about young people with actual young people in the community and with organizations that work with and serve young people.
Yeah, it's amazing. The Institute's evolved and developed in such amazing ways. And I do think it's highly relevant in our world, as you've already referred to with COVID and the weight generation. That affects all youth, but of course there's many other questions that affect particular groups of young people. And yeah, it's a real point of pride that the Institute for Child and Youth Studies is so very engaged in community and developing all of these questions and applying them to the world in which we live, and particularly in the Southern Alberta community. So I think that's fantastic and really exciting work. So thanks for carrying that on and growing it and developing it beyond what we'd originally conceived of. So great work.
Thanks, Janay. Well, it's like I say, it's a dream gig, and I'm really lucky to have the opportunity to do this work. And, I had no idea when I came to the first Child and Youth Studies conference back in 2011 at the U of L. I had just finished my PhD, and my training was in history, firmly bounded within that particular discipline. And I thought this conference sounds interesting. And then I got to Lethbridge, and the landscape was gorgeous. The people were really nice. And intellectually, it was one of the best conferences I'd ever been to. So it made me want to come and be a part of this community, which has continued to do really exciting things. So I would say, so this is actually kind of a nice segue into my next question for you, which is, I think, an opportunity to really, which is important at this moment, to take an opportunity to think about what a university does, why are universities important, And one of the things that makes universities unique, or makes them different from, say, colleges or high schools, but that also makes them play a really important social role, is that the teaching that happens at universities is performed by active researchers. So our research informs our teaching in a whole bunch of different ways. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about the relationship between research and teaching as it plays out for you, but also the pedagogical goals that you have in particular for the courses that you teach in children's history, and now liberal education.
Yeah, absolutely. And so my teaching has evolved with my research, and I've begun to, well, develop courses, but also components of every course that have age as a discussion. So age is a category of sort of power relationships in a society, but also a way to understand how societies are organized. And I also have a course, my favorite course is my 4th year seminar on youth culture in early modern Europe. And this has completely come out of my research and my work with the Institute for Child and Youth Studies. And so it is, it's a really rewarding class, because the goal of that class is for the students to understand the power that they have as young people. Now, of course, I'm generalizing here because we have mature students, and not every student in the class is a youth, but a large percentage of our students fall into that category of youth, at least defined by the government of Canada, of under 30, right? And so it's for me, it's about removing ourselves from our time and our place to understand a different context of early modern Scotland that has a lot of similarities. So I've already talked about, the sort of underemployment, huge inflation, a politically evolving, rapidly evolving climate, and all of these things. And now COVID, I mean, this was an era of pandemic as well. They had pandemics of smallpox, they had pandemics of the plague, still circulating. Every generation faced an outbreak of plague during this point in time. And to really have students be able to understand, removed from any sort of bias that they've had, their own understandings as the way that they've grown up, because sometimes it's really difficult to critique our own society when you're in the middle of it and you've embraced and internalized the messages and the values that you have been brought up with. So this allows us to really distance ourselves and to use history, understand contexts that are similar, and begin to understand how very, very important young people were to shaping these environments and shaping values, structure, shaping politics, shaping religion, shaping the witch hunts is another theme that I talk about in a lot of my classes. And so for me, it's about really having students be able to create a critical awareness of who they are in the world and the role that they play. Too often we all feel like, I'm just one person. What difference can I make? Why even bother voting? But the liberal education mandate at the university, in addition to the themes that I've already talked about, interdisciplinarity, making connections across different approaches and disciplinary perspectives, and critical thinking, the 4th pillar of our liberal education is global citizenship. And for me, that course is kind of the crowning course for me to bring that together to my students. It's a 4th year seminar meant to be capstone courses in the history department anyhow, where they bring together all the great skills that they've been learning, their research skills, their communication skills, their critical thinking skills, their attention to detail, their understanding of historical empathy, or their ability to understand people who are completely different from them and get where they're coming from. And all of these are really, really important skills. But for me, it's also the capstone of, here's your liberal education. How do you become a global citizen? And I don't care what your political leanings are. I don't care what it is that you are passionate about and you care about. I want you to be engaged. And I want you to take all of that learning that you have got in your university degree, and recognize it as the foundation of who you are in the world and who you will become in the world, and use that education to get engaged, make your community better, make your neighborhood better, make the world better, because you're bringing with you an understanding that your voice is powerful, even if you're a young person, even if you've been grown up to be, or even if you've grown up to be like, well, I'm not part of the adult world yet because I don't have a career, or I'm not married, or whatever the criteria is in your world of being an adult. That, you know, your voice is incredibly powerful, and it matters, and you should get engaged, because that's how we're going to navigate this really complex world that we live in, and this world that is rapidly evolving. So for me, that's my pedagogical goal in my fourth year class, and I have other classes as well. I do a representations of parenthood class for women and gender studies that I teach every other year, and we talk about a lot of these same sorts of issues, with a different focus, of course, but I do try to bring age and that category of understanding into most of the courses that I teach. So how about you? What do you think? How does that affect your teaching and your research?
Oh, yeah. So I would say they're inseparable. And one of the things that I really cherish and I'm lucky to have is if I'm working on something that, if I'm dealing with a particular set of archival sources, I'm puzzling through how to write about a question, I bring it to my class and I ask them what they think based on the readings and the discussions that we have been having. So research not only shapes what I do in the classroom, but what I do in the classroom and what I learn from my students also ends up shaping the research that I end up publishing. So I would say that's one answer. And another one is, I would say, one of my pedagogical goals. So as a historian, one of the things that I try to do in my scholarship and teaching is connect local contexts to global processes and currents. And so in every course that I teach, whether the focus is on Southern Alberta or on the British Empire, I make sure to encourage students to make these connections. So I offer, for example, a second-year course about the history of childhood. And in this class, I talk about how children, and this relates to what you were saying about early modern Europe as well, that in colonial contexts, especially when European countries are expanding geographically into different parts of the world and trying to so-called civilize the populations that they encountered there, children are at the heart of these efforts. And so this is a big thing that's happening globally, but it shaped life in Southern Alberta as well. And so when I teach this course, I ask my students to read parts of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And then we talk about the fact that really close by to Lethbridge, there were 2 residential schools on the Blood Reserve. And so what does that mean for thinking about the history of the place, of Blackfoot territory that we all call home, and for understanding the lives of young people in the past, locally, but also in places that are really different from where we live and work.
Yeah, and those connections are just so critical, right? To be able to make history relevant, because it is absolutely essentially relevant to understanding where we are today, how our society has been shaped the way that it has been shaped, what sort of underlying assumptions we have about our society. And so it's, history really allows us that perspective to step back and figure out these complex realities in which we live, and some of the really complex questions and challenges that are coming out of this. So, reconciliation, absolutely essential. How do we go about doing something that is as complex as, reconciling hundreds of years of a reality that has created so many disadvantages and so much challenges? and still respecting, the resiliency and the voices and the power of our Indigenous neighbors, and especially the young people. So these are really, really complex types of questions, and I think that Child and Youth Studies really helps explore these questions. And as you're talking, it makes me really proud that the U of L has such a strong criteria, or a strong group and core of child and youth studies on campus. And that's, what makes us unique, our liberal education mandate, but also, every scholar has their own area of expertise and their own area of research. And so that is what makes our history department completely different than Calgary's history department, or, Edmonton's history department, or Mount Royal, or wherever. We don't, unlike the K-12 system or the college system, where you teach a set curriculum, our curriculum comes out of our research. And so, but it's exploring, it's developing those skill sets, but it's on the cutting edge of research. And I love, as you said, the students actually shape the research and those questions that researchers are exploring. And so every single, department is moving forward in their own directions and their own criteria. And so I think that that's really, really an important concept that not necessarily everybody understands about universities or institutions, that, it may seem like, a history department or history faculty member can just be, easily substituted. But we all have separate expertise. And so for somebody to step into my early modern youth culture class, there's nobody on campus that can do that, right? And so nobody has that expertise, just like I couldn't step into your British Empire class. And so, but these are all equally important ways of moving forward curriculum and educating students about the latest questions that are facing our society and research. So,
yeah, well said. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would add one thing to that as well, which is that, so my interactions with students in the classroom and beyond, they shape my research, but I also in the past few years have discovered how great it is to collaborate with students as researchers, and to bring them to conferences, to co-author and co-present academic papers, and to publish with them as well. And I think that those kinds of opportunities, that's something else that distinguishes the U of L from other universities, and and shows, as you say, I think that every history department, every academic department in different universities has a different set of strengths that can't be replicated. I'm going to ask you my last question now. And I know that this is something else that you have done a lot of work ongoing, and that you're especially passionate about. And it's about basically what happens after students graduate from the U of L. And so how do you think courses in child and youth studies, and I would add in the humanities as well, how do they help to prepare our students for their lives after the degree?
Right. And so our students, it's an interesting question because, if you take a professional degree like engineering, you know that you're going to become an engineer. If you take education, you're probably going to become a teacher, although lots of people become a teacher for a short amount of time and go somewhere else, or start somewhere else and come back to teaching. And so, if you get a degree in history or English or philosophy or religious studies, it's not as clear where you'll go. I'll use history as the example because it's the one I know the best. But, people kind of think, well, there's a few things you can do with history. You can be a teacher, which is true, and a lot of our students go there. You can work in the heritage industry, so archives or museum studies. Yes, true. Also great areas to go into. Some people might come up with, well, it's a good background for law, which it certainly is, because our whole way in which we do our work is that we look at a whole lot of evidence, we sift through the evidence, and we try to come up with what we believe actually happened. And then we convince people using evidence of that. And so, that's kind of what lawyers do, and in a lot of ways. And so we look at, so that might be another area. But in 2016, Universities Canada did a study, and it showed that of the 40, I can't remember if it's 41 or 43% of Canadians, 40,000 Canadians with a history degree, that percentage, just over 40%, end up in the fields of business, finance, administration, and management. And so they go into all sorts of different places. And so I've been spending the last 3 years or so working with two of our alum quite closely, Matthew and Penny Stone, both 1998 undergrad degrees in history, and Penny also has an ed degree. And then Matthew did a master's degree in history, which he completed in 2000. I've also been working with a number of other alum, like Bruce McKillop and Kate Dugan. There's been a few different people that we've been working with who have degrees in different areas in the humanities as well. But basically what we're looking at is helping students, because to say, you can do anything with your degree, that just requires a degree, because the foundation of your degree is really who you become. I've already talked about this a little bit. It's how you think. You become a critical thinker, a problem solver. You think outside the box. You think creatively about problems that are facing our world, and you understand the complex contributing factors to those problems. So that problem solving is much more effective than looking at something very narrowly as a small issue, right? Or something that is, here's our issue, we're gonna solve it in this way. Unless you understand the context of that problem or that issue that you're trying to address, then, those solutions aren't going to be very effective. They become Band-Aids. You really need to be able to understand the heart of the challenges and all the complex contributing factors, and come up with complex answers to questions, multifaceted answers to questions. And so I think that our students in the humanities are really, really well trained for that. They, in particular, they understand that question of what is it to be a human being? Right? So often, if our society is looking at something just from the economic perspective, they're missing out on how people are really feeling about different things, where people's priorities are. They might come, people don't all just prioritize money. I mean, money is important, and I don't want to dismiss that, because it does matter. And people need to eat, right? These are key issues. But people also really care about, their belief systems. They care about their family, their communities. They care about, beauty and art. They care about all sorts of different things. And so I think that the humanities really allows for our students to come out and really understand what people are thinking. And in a very sort of basic, what are they going to do with their jobs? That makes them incredible employees. Most businesses, companies, organizations, profit, not-for-profit, they have customers and coworkers. And if you can come in and you can really understand where somebody else is coming from, you become a really incredibly valuable person, employee. But for me, I'm also super interested in that fourth pillar of LibEd. You become a really great member of our community, both locally and globally. So making those local and global connections, like you're saying. And so for me, the humanities background is really, really important. Child and youth studies, by really looking at a child-centered perspective, understanding things from the young people that are experiencing, these historic changes, or if you're looking at it from a neuroscience perspective or an ed perspective or an anthropological perspective, practicing these different approaches really gives you that insight and that training that, you automatically can begin to understand complex ideas. And so, in our future, I really think that this is, and it's not just me, 21st century skills, right? If you look at the Conference Board of Canada or Forbes magazine or any major studies on the 21st century workforce, these 21st century skills, as they're being termed, these adaptable skills that are coming from the humanities training and social science training as well, are very much about this adaptability. They're the soft skills that become the foundation of who you are as a human being, how you think and address problems, and how you approach both your community and your workplace, and the work that you do that make you really, really valuable. And so, these are really, really important skills. They're in high demand by employers. We've done all sorts of research, and not just us, but everybody else has been doing this research, and they're coming out as the skills that will be in the highest demand in a world and both a world and in an employment environment that is rapidly changing and evolving, especially with COVID. We need people who can adapt their skills to a variety of different pivoting businesses and pivoting society. So while the professional programs are still super important, I'm not dissing them in any way, shape, or form, they train people for particular types of jobs. Our students get trained for a whole variety of jobs and to be able to adapt their skills to many, many different environments. So yes, as you can say, I could go on and on about this super passionate topic that I've been involved in a lot lately. So.
Oh, thank you. I think that's great. And it's funny, I would say as historians, we don't, speculating about the future is not generally our stock in trade. But I think that the point that you've just made is a really important one about what studying the humanities and social sciences gives our students once they finish an undergraduate degree, is that they have a whole basis of transferable skills, ways of questioning and thinking and researching and organizing knowledge that will basically mean that they're okay and they will be able to do jobs that don't even exist yet.
Yeah, and who knows what the statistic is now, but I read a statistic maybe 4 years ago or so, which said that 60% of jobs that will exist in 10 years haven't even been created yet. So how do you train for that unless you train for skills that are going to be adaptable and transferable? So I completely agree with that. And our world is rapidly evolving. So, our students really, really have a strong foundation and background to be able to take these ideas and transfer them. So, maybe they end up in a field that studies children or that works with children and youth, which is great if they've got this perspective. If they do go into teaching, or if they, end up working in not-for-profit sectors, working with young people or doing young people programming or whatever it is that they're doing, counseling, youth counseling, there's a bazillion jobs that deal with children and youth, but just the ability to understand markets, understand communities, and understand that young people are a real driving force in the direction of our society. And so that will just make them so much more adaptable as they go out into the world of work, so, and into their lives as citizens. So
thank you. We've covered a lot of ground. That's great. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we say goodbye?
No, I just want to say thanks so much for having this chat with me. It's always fun to talk children and youth studies and humanities and social sciences and all the things that I know both of us have similar values in. And so thanks for taking the time to do this today.
Oh yeah, thanks for asking me, Janay. It's a real pleasure. And thank you. And I can't wait to see what you do next.
Thanks. And thanks to our listeners.